This is Hart Hagan with the Climate Report, and I'm here with Nick Alden. I'm in Louisville, Kentucky. Nick is in Rochester, New York. Nick, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Doing good. So the Climate Report, the purpose of the Climate Report, I've been doing it 3 years. I've done over 300 episodes. The purpose is to solve the problem of climate change. And my views have evolved. I don't identify anymore with the mainstream climate movement, but there's a range of opinions that are valid, and we're going to talk about those. And Nick, you were saying that there's a kind of like different places where people can fall. So explain what you think about the different types of opinions people can have on climate.
Well, in my non-expert opinion, because I'm not an expert, I just feel I know which expert, I feel I can know enough to know which experts to trust. I see it as there's a spectrum, and that on the far right, you have people like Donald Trump who don't believe in climate change. Don't really believe there's a climate. I don't take him seriously. But well, there actually are very few people that are actually just purely like that. So there's another category to the left of that I call the skeptics. There are people who don't believe that the climate is being changed by people. They believe in natural and landscape use changes being the cause. Then you have to the left of them, you have the lukewarmists. You have people like Matt Ridley and Bjorn Lomborg, or people who are saying climate's warming, but it's not warming at a catastrophic rate. Then to the left of them, you have eco-modernists, and maybe I'm wrong to place them on train tracks exactly like this. I'm just saying that I'm seeing this is more how I see it. The eco-modernists are people who believe that we can solve the problems, the environmental problems, through capitalism, through human flourishing, through prosperity, and not just through limiting human actions. Then to the left of them, you have people like Allen Savory, people who are in the permaculture movement, are people who believe climate change is a very serious thing, but who, for some reason, offer solutions that put them outside the orthodoxy. I would include Michael Moore in that, actually, because he did the movie Planet of the Humans, and he got treated worse than some people who don't really believe in climate change at all.
So what category are you putting Michael Moore in?
I'm putting him in the just outside the orthodoxy, like sitting outside the gate kind of thing. And I would put Allen Savory in there too. Now, then you have a very small sliver that I would say it's 7 different things that I've tried to outline, but I'd say it's mostly the center of it is renewables. The idea that we need wind and solar to replace it. You were talking about how you thought there's narrow corporate interests are guiding the mainstream climate movement, and I would largely agree. There's also kind of a Malthusianism, kind of a remapping of the classical world onto the modern world, onto the modern science. There's a man named Alden Chase, who's a philosopher, who wrote a book back in the 90s. And he outlined how the environmental movement was taking old Greek and Roman classical myths, or not the myths themselves, not consciously, but taking the general sense of them and applying them to the modern way of thinking about the world. The idea that we are like Prometheus, that we are trying to subvert the order of the universe by trying to destroy the environment, and that what we need to be humbled and put in our place. That's what I see as the orthodoxy, and that's what I see as the problem, because it's not, there are books written by people who are environmentalists saying, I don't believe in climate change. So which is not like, there's lots of things that go together. You can be someone who believes in climate change, and you can be against renewables like Michael Schellenberger is. You can believe in you can not believe climate change is very serious, and you can be an environmentalist. So as far as I'm concerned, it's when people say to you, do you believe in climate change? They are offering you a loaded term.
Right. So let me share with you where I'm coming from with that. I see that we have a problem with governance. We have a problem with how decisions are made. Sometimes I say that we have a lack of democracy. And, democracy gets a bad name, really. I mean, we have a really an elitist way of ruling. Democracy we've never seen democracy. But what I'm saying is that we don't have government of, by, and for the people. We have government that is of, by, and for the people who have the most money, and not just the 1%, but also the 1% of the 1%, are the ones who have the real power. So, as a result of that, one result of that is that we have media channels that are just polluted. The corporate media is not news, and it's not even good commentary. It's a propaganda system for the interests of the people that own the media and the people who sponsor the media. So we don't have a functioning, not only do we not have a functioning democracy, we don't have a functioning public dialogue, public discourse. So that's one thing that I would say, not to negate or invalidate anything you're saying. I just think it's one of those really systemic things that we have to talk about, because what we don't want to do, I don't think we want to pretend that if we had all the answers, that there's somebody listening to it who's somebody listening to us who's going to implement the good ideas that we have. So does that make any sense?
It makes perfect sense because, the only contribution that I want to make with my life in this regard is to point out the poison, not to point out what necessarily, there's tons of good things in the world. I wanted to identify a particular brand of poison because I felt there was a time when I thought, well, maybe everything is a lie and maybe everything capitalism is doing is working. No. Capitalist interests are very messy and they fill the world with lobbyists, and there's all sorts of special interests going on. I'm not here to deny any of that. What I'd like people to be aware of is another kind of poison that comes from, it is central to the way the modern environmental movement operates. And there's lots of people who have written about it. It's the bad frameworks. Mm-hmm. And and even if we got rid of all the corporations and we got rid of all the special interest and all the big money and all the Koch brothers, there's still a kind of poison that's polluting our ability even to think sensibly about what is the greedy interest.
So explain what you mean by frameworks, and if you can give an example, and then where are those frameworks coming from?
Well, one of the frameworks that I think is really disastrous is a Malthusian framework, because Malthus preached that there are too many people on the planet consuming too much, and that we have to somehow either voluntarily or involuntarily reduce the population. I think that's
You're saying not only was Malthus somebody who was influential, not only a certain person in a certain time who had a certain opinion, but it's kind of like a worldview, and that's been adopted today.
Very much. And Malthus is a big part of it. The other part of it is kind of this reflexively anti-capitalism. I used to think, oh man, I really don't like socialism. And to be sure, lots of communist countries are no fun to live under. It's just that it's not even that. It's just being reflexively anti-capitalist, anti-anything capitalist. I think that's why Alan Savory, who is the least capitalist person I can think of, well, maybe not the least, but he's not a capitalist, but I think he's perceived as one.
Well, I don't think he's anti-capitalist either. I mean, part of I think his views of capitalism and business are similar to mine, in that, well-run small enterprises can be really good. And so let me give you my stump speech on capitalism. The problem is not that capital exists. I mean, you could envision a world in which there is no capital, no money, et cetera. And that's a good that's a good thing to think about. But for the time being, we're going to have money, and therefore we're going to have capital. Capital refers to financial capital. It disregards, usually that whole conversation disregards social capital and natural capital and other types of capital. But the problem with capitalism is that we don't have governments that are willing to stand up to the very rich. We have increasing amounts of capital being concentrated into the hands of a very few, and that's the problem. It's not the existence of capital, it is the concentration of capital into the hands of a very few so that they get to run the show.
Well, it's funny. I tried to figure it out and I realized I was being stupid whenever I did one of two things. If I rejected wealth generation or wealth redistribution, I was being stupid. And so now I would say, you need to not turn off the faucet, but you need to make sure everybody gets a bucket of water.
Mhm.
And so I feel politically homeless because so many people, I can't even find very good frameworks that allow us to redistribute wealth while still generating it. And I might add that it's the reflexively anti-capital, it's as poisonous as the reflexively anti-socialist thing that so many people are worried about. So many people are worried about socialism and they're reflexively anti-socialist, and will do.
Well, yeah, you keep using the word frameworks, and I think that, I think that what you're expressing when you say frameworks is very much in line with how I feel that we have a propaganda system that is able to frame things in ways that work for them. And usually it's in a way that has us lowly people, the 99%, especially the 80%, fighting among ourselves, being divided. And so does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And I realized, as someone with a master's degree in library science, somebody went to liberal arts college and studied, that was the only thing I wanted to point out when I got out, was the poison in a particular kind. It's not the only poison. There's poison on both sides, as you might say, if we can even say there's two sides. But there was this particular brand of poison that really worried me. This anti-growth, anti-prosperity, reflexively anti, because it can be good to be anti-big business. It can be good to be anti-capitalist up to a point. It's when you start thinking, well, there's too many people in the world.
Well,
How do we?
there's so many issues we could talk about there. Let me talk a little bit about growth and economic growth and prosperity, et cetera. When we say economic growth, we're referring to GDP, gross domestic product. Economic growth, by definition, means that a national economy, for example, is going to be 3% bigger than it was last year. So GDP is growing. GDP is measured by the total amount of total amount of net profits of businesses, plus the total amount of net revenues of governments, plus the total amount of wages and salaries, something along those lines. And it's essentially a measure of the amount of money that's changing hands. Unfortunately, it is equated with human well-being. And why should we think that human well-being has anything to do with the amount of money that's changing hands? So a couple of problems with GDP. For one thing, we're not taking into account, there's a lot of off the balance sheet liabilities, and there's a lot of off the income statement expenses. When you destroy a forest, turn it into timber, and then turn it into farmland, you're increasing the GDP represented by that land. But are you increasing the value of the land? Are you increasing, it completely disregards the expenses and the costs that go along with it. So, when we talk about, we could talk about prosperity, but I don't think we should equate growth and prosperity if growth is defined as growth in GDP.
Well, I would only say that I think prosperity has to be a part of the framework we use.
Mhm.
I'm not here to say that prosperity is the only and or even the biggest end goal, because so much of the world is living in poverty still. And I'm trying to fight against the special interests that would say, well, not everybody in the world can have a refrigerator kind of thinking. As much as possible, there are lots of people who would say, well, we just redistribute the wealth. then we still wouldn't be enough. It's having all the ingredients together that I'm looking for.
Enough for who? Who are we trying to get enough to?
Every human being on the planet.
Okay.
We want to increase the standard of living.
See, most people would say that's their problem. If people aren't getting what they, if countries aren't getting what they, if countries are poor, it's their fault. If people are poor, it's their fault. That's where most people are coming from. And not just Republicans, Democrats are not doing anything at all to push back on that narrative. And therefore, they're part of the problem.
Well, the problem is that, as I see it, is that we're being told that we have less resources available than we actually do, or that we can't use them. And as much as I can push back against that, I try to, because there's very little I can do to bring comfort or alleviate affliction to people globally. But the most important thing we can do to make it possible for people globally to have a little bit more is, well, because everybody else is focused on the redistribution, at least to my knowledge, maybe not everybody, but it seems to me the biggest challenge is convincing people that other people in the world, in poor countries, developed countries, can have some of these things that we treat as luxuries.
So we could talk about, we could, there's a lot we could talk. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left. We're going to do this in about 20-minute segments. So I would say people in other countries, what is depriving them of a fair share of the wealth? And I would say that most people in most countries have the resources to raise themselves out of poverty. And they're not allowed to use their own resources because the United States is the head of a worldwide empire that deprives people of natural resources.
Well, I see the biggest obstacle is energy, because we're not allowing people to have carbon-free, reliable, cheap energy, right? And there's a book that I recommend called Apocalypse Never, which goes into that better than I can, written by somebody who actually knows what he's talking about. What I got out of it is that we're being told that people have to live simply, and that people are told that we just can't, the planet can't afford people using the kind of energy that it would take for everyone in the world to have the standard of living we have in the West. But in fact, we can. Everybody could have
at least my question is, what are the steps toward that? What are we trying to get to, and what are the steps toward that? Systemically, what are the obstacles to getting to where we want to go? And so what would that look like?
We would need to essentially, one, we'd have to take the exaggeration of harm done to the environment that does exist and debunk it, so that we can start using resources more wisely, so that we're not just squandering and keeping things in the, because we're basically, the problem that we have, the biggest obstacle we have, is people think poor people can't use the resources that the West already uses in abundance, because that would destroy the planet.
Well, who's saying that, and why are they saying that?
I think it's mostly most mainstream activists are saying this. People like Greta Thunberg and AOC are telling us that because the world will end in 12 years, even the West shouldn't have refrigerators, TVs, computers. The standard of living has to go down, and we need a degrowth type of thinking. And they may not, I'm not saying they said anything like that outright, but that's the worldview they're coming from.
Let's explore that on the next segment. This has been almost 20 minutes. Nick Alden, this has been a great conversation. We're going to come back on the next segment and talk about growth and what the mainstream climate movement is saying. And that'll be a great conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Pleasure to have you.
Let me find the right button here. There we go.